before we do that, I want to take a quick look at two things. Two new cards that I found incredibly interesting. These are not going to be blind reacts. I have seen both of these cards before. I've already said something about one of the cards on my Twitter, but I wanna talk about these two because I think they are both very interesting in terms of their design, and I think they also fit very well into today's stream because we're gonna have some discussions today about like the direction that the game is taking on the one hand in terms of their card design, which we're going to look at now, but on the other hand also with the decisions that were being made on this newest TCG Forbidden and Limited list, right? The cards I'm speaking of, and we're going to start with the little bit less exciting one first, but there's two new cards from the Infinite Forbidden that have been announced. The first one is called Vesper Gearu. It's a quick play spell card. When I saw the name, I was expecting it to be Orcus support for some reason because it said Gearu, but I don't think it has anything to do with it. But it reads as follows. You can only activate one card with this card's name per turn. If your opponent controls 2 or more monsters than you do, your opponent can send any number monsters they control to the graveyard. Also, you apply this effect based on the number they control. This is basically, your opponent decides how many monsters they want to keep. Hold on. Give me a second. So your opponent decides how many monsters they want to keep, right? And then based on how many they decide to keep, one of these effects is applied. If they decide to keep no monsters, your life points are halved. Like if I activate the player who activates this card, if the opponent sends all monsters to the graveyard, that halves their life points. If they decide to only keep one monster, they gain 2,000 life points. If they decide to keep 2 monsters, they banish their entire hand face up until the end phase. And if they decide to keep 3 or more monsters, they cannot activate monster effects for the rest of this turn, right? I think this card reads very exciting because it's kind of like it does a lot of things right in its design, in my opinion. However, I think this card is going to be slightly worse than you would expect. So one by one. The reason why I think this card is interesting in terms of its design is because number one, it's a quick play spell. I do love quick play spells in modern Yu-Gi-Oh! In terms of the design, because I hate when they design quote-unquote board breakers that are only good going second. Therefore, you can only play them in a blind second deck, or you can only side deck them. They cannot really have an impact in like standard game ones, right? Because they wouldn't really fit into a main deck, right? So I like that this is a quick play spell that can theoretically also be used when you go first. The other thing that I like about this card is that it is something that theoretically heavily punishes like overextension and all that kind of stuff, right? The fact that like the more monsters your opponent has, the more this card hurts, right? And that is a good thing if you want to tackle the problem of like, hey, people are doing too much on their first turn, so we're gonna give people a tool to deal with that, right? The big problem with this card is that the decision is basically in your opponent's hands, right? Like your opponent gets to choose how many monsters they want to keep. And that is usually not a good thing. Now, the thing is, when I first saw this card, that was before I learned that Baron was going to be banned. Because this card, you're going to notice, this card is specifically bad into Omni Negates. Because the way this card interacts with Omni Negates is quite terrible. Because, let's say, just for the argument, your opponent has Baron on the field, right? I know Baron is going to be banned for us, but just to get the point across. Give me a second. So the reason why this card is so bad into any sort of negation is that there's 2 scenarios. Either your opponent has an Omni Negate on the field, which means when you activate this card, you can just it just gets negated and it does nothing. It baits an Omni Negate, which is okay, but still it doesn't achieve what you want it to achieve by getting negated, right? The second thing is, if you have baited the Omni Negate before, in order to resolve this card, your opponent can just send all of the cards that they have already used to the graveyard, right? Like if they if they just go like, okay, I have 3 monsters, you activate something, they go bear negate, and then you activate this, and then they're like, okay, well, I can just send all the stuff that I have already used this turn to the graveyard, and then I'm not going to be phased that much by this card, right? So the idea of this card is obviously the more monsters your opponent keeps, the harsher the drawback for your opponent is, right? Like if they keep 3 or more, they can't activate anything for the rest of the turn, so they obviously can't really do that. The thing, if they keep exactly 2, is kind of interesting because it says banish your opponent's entire hand face up until the end phase. This means your opponent cannot use hand traps after you use this, right? Like if they want to keep 2 monsters, they can't use hand traps because they have to banish all their hand. That is interesting. However, the problem, once again, is that the opponent gets to decide if they want to keep 2 or not, right? Like if the opponent has 3 hand traps in hand, they're simply going to go down to 1 monster. And if they have no hand traps in hand, then they can just go and keep 2, right? That's their decision. It's not your decision based on whether you think they have a hand trap or not. No, it's your opponent's decision when they know if it's good for them to keep their hand or not, right? They can basically make the decision that's better for them. And that's always the problem with cards like this one. That is also, by the way, a problem with evenly matched sometimes. You know, sometimes in some matchups, evenly just isn't great because your opponent gets to choose which card to keep, and they will always, by default, pick the option that is best for them and keep the most important card, right? And that is the same with this card, right? They are presented with multiple options and they can always try and figure out the best one for them. That basically means this card is only as good as the worst possible option for you, or like the best possible option for the opponent. That being said, there might be decks out there that where this card is, no matter what the opponent does, this card is always going to be good, right? And that could be the case, right? Like that is something that this card, I can definitely see this card seeing play at some point because it's really good into certain matchups. However, I think on average, I'm not sure if this card is good enough. But I will say, I think the fact that this card basically reads, after I resolve, the opponent only has like 2 monsters on the field max, right? Like your opponent can end on however many monsters as they want. If you activate this card, they have to go down to maximum 2, pretty much, right? They can't keep more than 3 because then, you know, the card just wins you the game, right? So I do think this card is good. It has potential. I think it remains to be seen if it actually is good enough to see main deck play as a quick play spell card. Because once again, if your opponent is spamming monsters and you set this card, and they have 3 or more monsters, they have to go down to at least 2, right? And going first, this thing is a lot bigger of a deal than when you go second, right? Like if your opponent has, let's say you have only 1 monster on the field and your opponent gets to 3, they have 3 monsters on the field now, right? And you activate this, your opponent basically has to go down to 1. Right? They can't just say like, yeah, I'm gonna banish my entire hand for the rest of the turn, because then they can't play. Or they have to set their important spell cards, which is also another interesting development, right? Like imagine this card starts seeing play and suddenly you have to start setting your important spell cards before you play. But then that enables maybe someone to pop them or banish them with Little Knight and all that kind of stuff. And this is specifically what I like about this card, is it's not as simple as like evenly matched, where it's like, hey, I go second, I slam this card down, it's either good or it's not. This card is much more nuanced. It really makes you think how to use it. And I do like this card. I think this card is going to be interesting. I think it's going to see experimentation, and I definitely think it has the potential to be good enough. While I don't think the card is broken, I simply don't think the card is broken, and that's how I know that I like the design of a card. When it gets me thinking, I can see a lot of different use cases for it, and but it doesn't seem broken, right? That's good card design, in my opinion. I think this card is great. Similar to the Metal Tronius card that we're getting in Legacy of Destruction, that is another example of a card that I really like the design of. So, and I think that sort of stuff is great, right? Quick play spells with interesting interactive effects are a great way to fix a lot of the problems that this game has going forward. So I'm very excited about this card. Another card that I want to talk about that is probably even more worth discussing or talking about. This thing has made the rounds already. So, long story short, this card is basically a more balanced version of Max C. And that is interesting. So let's read this thing. It's called Mul Chami Purulia. I don't know if this is an archetype even, because this says during the turn you activate this card's effect, you can only activate one Mul Chami monster effect, not counting discards. So there seems like there is more Mul Chami cards out there. I'm not aware of any. But we'll see if this becomes an archetype or not. The effect is the following. If you control no cards, quick effect, you can discard this card. Apply these effects for the rest of this turn. Each time your opponent normal or special summons a monster from the hand, immediately draw one card. During the end phase, if the number of cards in your hand is more than the sum of cards your opponent controls plus 6, shuffle random cards from your hand into the deck until you're equal to that sum. So this card is basically Max C, but with 3 changes. The first change is you can only use it when you control no cards, which right off the bat, that in my opinion pretty much makes this card a lot more balanced than Max C could ever be. That is one of the first things that people suggested for Max C, is to have it not be usable when you already have a board. Because one of the most broken things when it comes to Max C is the fact that you can back up your own board with it, right? You go first and you discard Max C behind your board, the game becomes basically unplayable, right? That is one of the most frustrating things about Max C, is when it's being discarded when your opponent already has a board and you're basically forced to play into it and you just instantly lose the game, right? That is a very important clause on the card, right? That being said, this makes this card, in my opinion, most likely a side deck card a lot of the time, unless you play a blind second deck, right? However, I don't think that's necessarily a problem. I think it's okay to print a card that is... Hold up. Unless you play a blind second deck. I lost my train of thought here. I think it's okay. I think it's okay to make a card that is not in everyone's main deck immediately, like Max C, but like a card that if your opponent is playing a deck that kind of likes to go a little crazy on the first turn, and you can side deck this card in against it to make sure you have a counter, to make those decks slightly less viable, right? And I think that's completely fine in terms of card design. You don't have to print a card that's an automatic staple in every single deck. You have to like think about when to use this card. And that's also because its effect just simply isn't as good as Max C's effect, because this is not good against every deck in the game, right? Unlike Max C. Each time your opponent normal or special summons a monster from the hand, you draw a card. This is literally... directly compared to Max C, this card is a lot more balanced. Like, I'm thinking of a lot of top decks in the format right now. A lot of the time, you wouldn't, even if they go full combo, you wouldn't draw 15 cards. You would draw like 2 or 3 against a lot of decks in the game, which is still powerful. It still helps going second a lot to draw a couple extra cards. But you're not drawing your entire deck. Your opponent is not forced to stop, right? Your opponent is not like, oh my god, if I play the game even a little bit, I lose the game on the spot. No, your opponent is like, okay, let's take an example here. Let's look at Snake Eyes, right? Snake Eyes, and because this card says normal summon as well, you have to basically shotgun it. You have to immediately discard it. Otherwise, your opponent is just going to normal summon, and that's one less draw you're gonna get, right? So you have to like draw phase, discard the little octopus, right? So your opponent knows what's up, and so your opponent can make the best possible plan with their hand. But still, let's say they decide, hey, I'm going to go on and do my Snake Eye combo, right? I'm going to normal summon Snake Eye Ash. The opponent draws 1. At this point, opponent is down to 5 cards. Snake Eye Ash resolves, adds a Poplar. You're going to summon the Poplar. Opponent draws another card. They go to 6 cards. And at that point, you might already be done with your special summoning from the hand in Snake Eyes. That might be it. You might be done. Your opponent just gets a draw 2, which is powerful, you know. That's pretty good. They get a +1, free +1, like the freest +1 ever. But maybe you're done, depending on what deck you're playing. Like maybe you're playing, if you're playing Fire King, you might summon the Garunix from hand. But that's basically the idea. The more you commit, the more you summon, the more your opponent draws, but not like every single summon, only like every other, right? Like not like if you do the full Snake Eye Fire King combo, the opponent doesn't sit there with 30 cards in hand, basically making the game unwinnable. Maybe they have like 3 or 4 draws off of this card, which is still powerful, but I think that's fine. I genuinely think the design on this card is good. I think it's good, and that is because it's a good card. If this was bad, if this was unplayable, it wouldn't be good card design either. Like, the card has to be playable if you want it to have an impact, right? So there's a lot of things that this card does that make it a good card, in my opinion. But there's also a couple factors that make it, in my opinion, well designed and good. So the first thing is, this card is going to be a side deck card a lot of the time, I think. I don't think it's going to be strong enough against every single deck so that you would want to main deck it, because the card is going to be dead going first almost all the time, unless you plan to end on an open board with nothing on it, which is not going to be the case. So I like this. I like this a lot because it also doesn't hit every single deck the same way. There are decks that this doesn't really phase at all, right? They will just like normal summon and then not really special summon from the hand much at all. Other decks get very, very punished by this card. Like, certain decks just are not good against this, which is annoying, but like fine. Like, I don't know, like Vanadium is probably one of those decks. Once again, an example that like well, this card is good against it. This card cooks Flu. I mean, yeah, you draw some card against Flu, but that's fine. I think it's fine. I just think genuinely, I think this card is fine. I think it's fine. Ashing this can be pretty bad if they simply cast it again. I mean, it's funny, right? Because this card does not say once per turn. So I have a couple questions in terms of the rulings to this thing. So theoretically, it would be allowed to activate 2 of this, right? Because it's not once per turn. The only thing it says is during the turn you activate it, you can only activate 1 other Mul Chami effect, pretty much, right? Because it says not counting this card. It doesn't count itself. So you can theoretically activate 2, right? You can theoretically activate 2 Mul Chami Purulia. But the thing is, do I just draw 2 per normal summon or summon from hand? Does that work? Yes. Okay. Because James, think of the 6 months. I think the main purpose, I'm gonna be honest with you, I'm trying to look at this from a card design standpoint. I think the reason why they did that was because they wanted to have a way that this doesn't just get ashed or called bide, and it's Drover, right? So that if you draw 2, you can just discard the other. Because I think a second copy of this wouldn't even be that insane. Like, I think the thing with a once per turn clause on these kind of cards is, if the card is fine, if the card is balanced, then it doesn't need to be once per turn on cards that need to be hard drawn anyways, right? I think it's fine. If it's part of an archetype, what if there are other that do special summons from other places like deck or graveyard? I was thinking about this too. I genuinely was thinking about maybe they make this an archetype of good going second cards that maybe even have synergies with each other, but are also generically good cards. I think that'd be interesting. I mean, I think as of right now, this card is going to do the following thing once it is released, right? My instinct is to put this card into my side deck pretty much every time. Not always, it depends on the format, but most of the time, I want to put this card in my side deck. And then I'm going to side it in to most matchups when I go second. Because almost every single deck is going, like every deck normal summons, right? And so I'm always going to get my 1-for-1, but then if my opponent goes a little crazier, I get more draws, right? But I never get like an insane amount of draws from it. Like I don't think this card draws you the amount of cards that always instantly wins the game, like Max C, so it doesn't force your opponent to stop. But basically what that means is when you go second against decks that go a little bit crazy on the first turn, you're just gonna have more cards to deal with their board, which I think is fair. You're gonna end up being able, like if your opponent goes for a full Snake High Fire King combo, which generates a lot of card advantage and a lot of interaction that is normally really hard to keep up with, instead of playing into it with 6 cards, I'm maybe gonna be able to play into it with 8. And that seems fair in my book. That is genuinely probably fair. And ironically, the Fire King Snake Eye deck probably still wins that a fair amount of the time, right? It's New Era Phantasme, and that's phenomenal. I've been saying this so much. I want going second cards to be like this, where I, instead of just throwing a hand trap at my opponent that stops their turn, like Shifter, Max C, or sometimes even Imperm or something like that, just like hoping they can't play the game, basically. I want my opponent to play the game when they go first, but I also want a chance to beat it when I go second, right? I don't want to be forced to stop my opponent from playing. I think Yu-Gi-Oh games are at its best when both players are playing the game, right? And so when a card like Max C is too powerful, even though in theory your opponent can play under it, it doesn't stop the opponent theoretically, but in practice it does, right? Because your opponent knows if they keep playing, they lose the game, right? This card doesn't do that. This card just gives me more tools going second to deal with their board, but it doesn't stop them from playing. And that's how you know it's good card design, if it does exactly that, right? So I love this. I love that they are following this idea of we're gonna make a more balanced Max C, because the idea behind Max C is fine. The intention that they had when they made Max C over, like, what is it, 12 years ago or 13 years ago, it was like, we're gonna make a card that punishes overextending on turn 1 and all that kind of stuff, right? And that was a fine idea. The problem is it got out of hand. Like, Max C is not good card design in modern day Yu-Gi-Oh anymore, right? Like, it was a fine invention in 2011, not a good idea in 2024. And so they needed to update it, basically. This is an updated version of Max C that is more suitable for modern Yu-Gi-Oh, and I like that a lot. And I personally think that this means that they want to ban Max C in the OCG. Maybe that's cope, but I cannot imagine that they want both of them to coexist. To me, this card clearly reads like an updated version of Max C that is going to replace Max C. If they don't do that, that's crazy in my head. In my head, that would be so wild if they made this card basically showcasing, hey, here's an alternative to Max C that is slightly toned down and doesn't stop your turn completely, and then they just keep Max C legal. That would be so weird. Anyways, that wouldn't even be my problem. That would be their problem, so it's none of my business. I'm just evaluating this card for the TCG right now, and for us, I think this card is a healthy addition to the format. I love these kind of cards. I love Phantasme. I love this card. I love what's the other one? Magical Spring. These kind of things where I can just go second. I can get some card advantage to play into their board. I love that kind of thing because it's so much more interactive, right? I love this. I'm a big fan of this card's design, and I would even say they could make more cards like this in like different directions. You know, maybe. Because this doesn't punish every single combo deck. There are certain combo decks that this just doesn't apply to. Like, I'm trying to think, like, as an example, what is like a What is like an example of a combo deck that this card does not really punish? Right? Math Mech? I mean, that's not even true though, right? Vanadium? Vanadium summons from hand like how often? Like a bunch of times, right? Like you special from hand Rykard, Visa, Starfrost, you can summon Vanadium Heart, you can summon the tuners from hand. Like this definitely hurts Vanadium. Branded? Yeah, Branded doesn't really care about this at all, right? Branded literally gives you one draw, if even, which is their normal summon. But if they open Branded Opening, they might even give you 0 cards, right? So like there are combo decks out there that this card, they don't care about it, right? Unchained, unless you draw the bricks. Unchained, yeah, maybe they summon Sharvara or Aruha from hand and they normal summon, yeah. But I think that's the cool thing about this card is even if you are not sure whether your opponent's deck really hard loses to... I mean, nothing hard loses to this, unironically. I don't think anything hard loses to this, but like, even if you're not sure if your opponent's deck is weak to this card, let's call it weak, you could theoretically still side it because, I mean, every deck is gonna normal summon, so you always get your 1-for-1, right? Now, I just love this design. I'm excited for the direction that they are taking in the OCG with these kind of card designs. Both of these cards that they've recently announced for Infinite Forbidden just are very exciting to play with and interactive as well. I like that a lot. Because this card also encourages interaction, right? Because what this card does is it encourages your opponent to still do their thing. Maybe skip on 1 or 2 summons from hand, but still do something, right? They're not going to stop because of this card. So they're still going to make a board. And you, as the player going second, you're going to have more tools available to deal with it, which is just phenomenal. Also, by the way, we haven't even talked about this. This clause on here on the bottom, I think that one's irrelevant. I think this is pretty irrelevant because it says during the end phase, if the number of cards in your hand is more than the sum of cards your opponent controls plus 6, shuffle random cards from your hand into the deck until equal to that sum. Like for that, like as an example, if your opponent ends on like 5 cards on the field, right? Which would be like a realistic end board nowadays. Let's call it, so let's say 5 cards is realistic. You would have to have 12 cards in hand, which is, you'd have to have 12 cards in hand, which would make it so that you'd have to have drawn 8 cards off of this. Right? You'd have to have drawn 8 cards, which is almost impossible. It's quite relevant if you nib them. Oh yeah, it can be that. That's true. Yeah, it's like if the opponent plays into Nibiru and then passes on just the token, but then you still need 7 cards in hand, right? No, 8. You still need 8 cards in hand. Look, a lot of things about this card remain to be seen. It remains to be seen whether this is going to replace Minn C for the OCG, which I think would be, but like honestly, Minn C being in the OCG, even though it doesn't technically affect us in the TCG, is still a huge annoying factor for me because it just makes the 2 games so far apart. Like it's so hard to compare and evaluate their decks for us because Minn C being in the game changes everything. And the same is true for Master Duel. I think if this is their replacement for Minn C that is balanced and can be in all 3 formats, and therefore they can ban Minn C, I think that would be great because then we could finally get a little step closer towards having those games like as close together as possible, right? Like they could ban Minn C in Master Duel as well. Even though this card, that is another thing. In Master Duel, this card would be a little bit more shaky because we don't have a side deck. Because like I said, this card is a lot better, I think, inside than in the main deck. I don't want to, quite frankly, I don't feel like it's great to be forced to main deck such a card when you want to go first. But still, I think this card is great. but like great in the sense that it's good, but well designed at the same time without being too broken. I think this card is cool.